Namaste. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, Sraddhalu.
Namaste and welcome to all of you.
We are happy to continue today the fourth installment of the special theme of how we can carry our current growth of consciousness deliberately in the next life. So if you have some questions on this topic, please, you may address them in our chat box on YouTube, or you may address your questions at our email, integralstudies.in@gmail.com. And first, I have a question which comes from a very close friend. We want to understand what was the experience, so I will just narrate in a very short sentence. This person was undergoing some treatment, some healing, and during the treatment, it narrates that an intense light was coming from above, penetrating the chest, and it was deeply, and it was almost for about 1 hour. And we were thinking, is this possible that maybe the soul was not fully integrated in that person, or how we could describe this experience? Because what I just remember is she said this light was coming directly from Sri Aurobindo, and it went directly deep into the chest area. And I'm just asking because I heard some people who doesn't have fully integrated their soul. Sometimes it comes later, or maybe just bits of the soul comes at the beginning or later fragments. So I just want some clarity.
Did she have
Thank
the
you.
experience as if there were parts of her which were left out, which then got integrated? Was that associated with this?
It felt like a unification, yes, and like an integration of something, yeah, very deep.
Yes. So the question itself was about whether, as a consequence of this, when the person experienced this integration, as if something had got more integrated, was it as if parts of the soul were left out or were not integrated, which then got integrated? So this sense of experience of integration, which can happen to us sometimes in an exceptional experience such as this, and surely in this case it was Sri Aurobindo's light working on the person and working to bring about that integration. But the integration can be of two kinds. The first is where the surface parts of your nature are disparate. For most of us, we have many pieces, many parts, which are each doing, so to say, their own thing. Some part of my emotions are attached to this, another part of my emotions is fixated on that, some part of my mind is on this, another part on the other, and then there are many things which shift according to my mood. I will say, when I'm in this mood, then I behave like this, when I'm in that mood, I behave like that. So there are again different parts. And so we are generally quite a crowd of conflicting and even sometimes contradictory thoughts, emotions, tendencies, impulses, desires, etc., all of which are as if formed around what may be called a kind of a shifting, changing nucleus that we call me, I, which would be called the ego personality, which is shifting. And so because this is so disintegrated, as even in our normal outer life, when there is a strong influence of this kind of a spiritual help, either in this case from Sri Aurobindo, or sometimes from a strong influence of the psychic presence, or something of your own higher self that draws, it's like the analogy is, if you've seen a marionette which is with strings, which is moved by the strings, and if you leave the strings, the marionette collapses. All the pieces, arms, legs, fingers, head, everything just falls plop, because the string which joins them is loose. Now if at that point you pull the strings above, raise it, the entire marionette comes into form, the pieces join, become aligned and become integrated as a whole. This is exactly the experience when our own higher self, what Sri Aurobindo refers to as the central being, when it pulls its influence upon the whole personality, tightens it, so to say, pulls the pieces together and compels a kind of an integration, you find all these pieces of your nature, personality, etc., as if suddenly tightening around whatever is at that point experienced as the center. So, this is one kind of experience of integration which could have been the case. But there's a second kind which also might have been, and possibly there was a little bit of that in what you have described, that there are actually other parts of us which are as if behind the veil in the layer that we would call the subliminal. The limb is the lit up part, the borderline of the lit up part, subliminal behind or hidden from the limbed surface lit up layer which we are conscious of. And there's a huge range of possibilities, capacities, tendencies, potential in all the layers: subliminal mind, subliminal vital, subliminal physical, etc. And the heart of it all is the psychic presence. The deepest center of it all, which holds it all together, is really the center, the true center. But so many things of your capacities are held in the subliminal. And it happens occasionally in a person's life when there is a significant influence of this kind, perhaps an experience of this kind actually, where direct help from above, or your own higher self pulling the strings, so to say, or the inner psychic pushing forward or drawing together certain elements which were now hidden behind the veil of the subliminal, are now pulled forward and as if activated in the surface personality. And sometimes it can be so radical that from one day to the next it's as if a different person. Of course, it's not a different person, it's still the same, you know that. And yet, so many things have got as if awakened, including sometimes certain kinds of memories, that you feel it's as if almost like a different person. So that also can happen, where things behind the veil, which were so to say fragmented and separate, got pulled forward, pushed forward, but integrated with the surface. And that was the sense of the integration which took place. And one would feel in such a case as if capacities that I had, which belonged to my soul, or which my soul has carried from prior lives or developed from prior lives, now suddenly coming forward, integrating, awakening in me, as if that would be the kind of feeling this integration would have. So it's different from the outer integration. There's an inner integration, and one or both could happen. Maybe both components were there in the experience you described, but my sense of it as you described it was more of the inner, something from the inner ranges came forward, as if you felt more complete in your capacities, in your fullness of your person, but things which were held behind, covered so far, as if come forward and integrate. So all of these are possible in a normal journey in the spiritual life. And now generalizing the question to all of us, you don't need to wait for a sudden, dramatic such intervention. It can happen also as a part of a progressive growth. But for that, what one would have to do is to make a conscious effort to turn your entire awareness towards a center within you which represents a deeper point of integration, either towards the inmost soul, psychic being, towards the sense of the self, or simply even in the highest part of the mind or the inner consciousness that you can reach, simply putting all of you in and around that and turned to that, and holding as if drawing the whole of you into and towards that. Staying in that state of concentration, we will call it meditation, concentration, in a state of one-pointed aspiration, and then slowly returning from there. And when you return, it's as if you return with a much more integrated, much more unified, much more centralized in aspiration as you return. You are as if a different person. Even if it went deep enough, you would have the experience of as if being newborn. That it's a whole new day, it's a whole new person, it's a whole new situation, and nothing of the past somehow seems to matter. You are as if freshly born now. Such could be, and eventually should be, our experience every day when we go into deep concentration, immersion, either in the psychic presence or the divine presence, in whatever way one feels. So I think this would be good enough.
I just wanted to ask, but is it possible that fragments of maybe these psychic beings, maybe some fragments, could it be possible that they're somewhere else and not fully integrated Maybe
Yes.
they rejoin at a different stage of your life. Is it possible that there's not the whole integration, but we are
Yes.
like
So it's
scattered?
not normally that the psychic being would have fragments. The psychic being would have aspects or powers or qualities or capacities which it has held within, let's say, developed across lives. Generally, before incarnation, the things needed for the life are put forward already. But the others are always present, held behind, and could be activated in special moments of life. So, even to the extent that if you're fully aligned at that moment with the psychic presence, you've had absolutely no experience of training in music, but it's been developed in some past. You could place your fingers on the keyboard or instrument, and with that full alignment held from there, play a piece of music with almost nearly the skill of a skilled musician. The moment that alignment falls apart or falls out, then that whole thing fades out. You say, how did I do that? I can't do it again. So, just to show that there are so many facets to the psychic personality, but not all may be put forward. But what is likely the case in what you have just described, although this could happen, it's rare. What is likely the case is certain aspects which were put forward had not yet been integrated with the surface personality. So they were just behind the subliminal, and at that moment they were allowed or they were drawn out and made to integrate. So you would feel as if parts of me as if were pulled forward or integrated. It's not the psychic being itself because it's not fragmented, it is one, it is indivisible. But facets or powers of it which would have been put out now suddenly came forward and got integrated. So to the surface personality, it may seem like, oh, there's pieces of me that came in and joined in and became more complete. But they were always there, but they were not part of this surface, they were behind the veil. Does that answer what you're looking for? Yeah.
We'll go to our questions. From Spirally, ayahuasca is an example of a lower vital energy, correct?
So this was from the questions in the YouTube channel questions. Is ayahuasca, it's, for those who might not know, it's a South American plant-based psychedelic drink. So is it an example of lower vital energy? And there's somebody who's by the moniker Truth Consciousness commented that a mother said that these people trying out psychedelics is the effect of the force working. It's a shortcut to get behind the surface reality, but not recommended. It depends on the person's consciousness, purity, aspiration, etc. So there were some comments of this kind. I wanted to put just on record that yes, in the past, even now, the plant-based triggers have been used as a way of going behind the surface reality, going into some kind of subliminal states. The point though one has to realize, a plant can only connect you to a layer that corresponds to its own consciousness. Because plants are essentially vital beings, or vital realities, entities, primarily. They can only take you into that domain, lower vital typically, or some part of the mental vital, depending on the plants, depending. More often than not, it depends on your internal state. So if you consciously concentrate on some particular quality or part of your consciousness, as you take that plant, you tend to get pulled into that. It was this particular skill which was used in some of these traditions which use the plants. If you could, for example, concentrate on your idea of some heavenly realm, or your concept of heaven, whatever that may be, and as you take that, you might find yourself pulled into that image or idea or world corresponding to your concept or your current state of consciousness. But it will still be in the vital worlds. I was present once when some people were doing this, and there was one lady who was from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and she said, oh, I want to see the seventh heaven. And then she got pulled into something and she was saying, oh, this is so wonderful, and all kinds of things. But the consciousness that she was in was so low. It was so low as to be almost disgusting. But the person's experience was like a glimpse of something which was very beautiful, at least to the perceiving consciousness. So my point though is, in any such means of psychedelic, the entry is of a very low grade from which you may or may not perceive things of different levels depending on your current mood, etc. I don't think it's so much a question of purity, but maybe of aspiration or direction in which you set your aspiration before you take those things. So in such ways, yes, but the consequence of an entry at a lower grade is, even if you have a glimpse of something of higher ranges of the vital, and it doesn't have to be too high, it can be of a lower vital heaven, and it will still be quite amazing to your vision, but still in the lower vital. The consequence of an entry on the lower vital is that you will also have beings of the lower vital who can play you. This is a part that the human beings who have not had the experiences don't understand, is that as soon as you're out of your physical body into any domain of the lower ranges, forget for the moment the higher ranges. In any of these ranges, form is flexible. Form itself can be simply willed. Substance is flexible. You can will a form, you can image a form around you or around another. You can even change their form if you have the skill. But more often than not, what you do is you create a form for yourself. So you are in that domain, let's say that grade, and a being comes of a very lower vital grade. It peeks into your mind, picks out from you your vision, concept, image of the highest deity that you would think you're looking for. It could even be some preceptor of yours that you say, oh, my teacher, my guru, my lineage, whatever it is, I want to see that one. And this fellow simply picks up the image from your mind and feeds it back to you, changes its form and feeds it back to you. You look and say, oh, this is the one. So if you're within the certain tradition, you say, oh, it's Jesus in your concept. It's not at all looking like the historical Jesus. It's your concept of whatever you saw in a book. Or one of the deities that you have seen, oh, this is my Durga. But it's a picture form, nothing of the consciousness. It's that lower vital entity taking on the form. And if at that moment you make the mistake of saying, this is it, the deity, the goddess, the god, bow down, listen to its guidance and follow blindly, you will have been massively misled. How would you know? You wouldn't, because you're on that grade. Unless there was something deeper guiding you, giving you a feeling, hey, something's wrong. It looks like that form, but it doesn't have the feel. That would come from a psychic protection, influence, discrimination, etc. So what people don't understand is, because our physical world is a domain of form, they think wherever you go, form will determine the validity of it. No, form is all scammed, can be scammed. More seriously, what's the grade at which through which you're looking at? It's of a lower vital. So at that point, the lower vital being that comes with or without form can easily hook into you on that grade, because a gateway has been opened which is not your opening and is not under your control. So the plant did that. It opened a gateway. That entity now coming, approaching you, a dangerous entity, you sense it is dangerous, but can you close it? No, you can't. Until the plant influence within your bloodstream has been washed out, you cannot close the gate. You are as if left vulnerable. And while you're vulnerable, those entities can get in, throw in hooks, make links that you are not aware of. It's like a fishing line, like you throw in the river to catch a fish. It's got a worm and a hook. The fish bites and then gets pulled. In this case, it throws a hook deep inside you through the gateway, hooks into you. Eventually, let's say an hour down, your gateway has closed, that hook still remains, the link is still there, and that entity can now play you, pull you, create trouble for you. It has got an entry point inside you. It's like got a hand or a finger inside you and can create trouble for you. So the problem of all these is they're extremely harmful, extremely dangerous. Fortunately, most people are so crude and coarse, as coarse human beings, that despite that, the extent of the exposure is somewhat dim. But for those who are sensitive, often it can be damaging, and the damage can last for the rest of your life. In some cases that we know, even once an entity is hooked in, it can even last across into the next couple of lives. So this is a serious issue. It's not just a question of lower vital energy, it's an opening to the lower vital energy by whatever means you have used from the plants. Extremely dangerous. Even if you think you're looking at a heavenly realm, you're actually opening on a very low crude grade of consciousness. And so I think I want to put this on record so that whatever may be the idea of your purity, your aspiration, etc., end of the day, irrespective of your purity, irrespective of your aspiration, the opening is on a lower grade and you're vulnerable to intrusions on that lower grade. I had again an example which is one of the reasons why I hesitate to say this too openly. Is a very spiritual person from a traditional lineage, highly respected himself and in the lineage, told me that when he was a teenager, he once took some drugs and he had an experience of opening, and that's what opened him to the spiritual life. And so he said, I don't see it as bad. I can see how it can be a gateway for many people. Point taken. Then asked him, did you use it again? He said, no, I didn't need to. So it was a trigger. To that extent, a knock on your head could have been a trigger. But the point is the hardening which is coming with our narrow education. The drug was triggered an awakening in him which allowed a deeper part of him to come forward, and then he didn't need that. He was fortunate that the deeper part came forward and took over, but still the vulnerability, it must have been a light drug and not a hard drug. Especially when you take the hard drugs, you're open to very violent and dangerous intrusions. So I want to put this on record that although people speak of positive potential, positive possibilities, the general advice and guideline will be just say no. Do not say, oh, I'm going to try it once, or I will use it to have an opening to something higher and then stop it. No, it will never open you to a higher thing. It will only open you to lower things. So I think we can go to the next question.
We have a comment from Kalpesh regarding Pratik's question that we took last time. Perhaps his problem is more about the consequences to a person who commits the harmful acts.
Yes, so if you recall last time we had a very long question commentary from Pratik where he was upset that our whole discussion about the reincarnation and the rebirth, etc., was not serious enough, he felt. And what about all the suffering that takes place sometimes in large numbers and in ways that damage people or people get butchered? What about all that? And you can't just say that the soul is just enjoying it or chose it. It's not true. It's not. You can't say the soul chose it. But what you can say is, yes, the soul chose to incarnate, and then there were all these consequences once in the body in that particular space. It's not always your choice. Nevertheless, the vehemence of Pratik's question, Kalpesh is suggesting, is perhaps because he's concerned about the other side. You may be, even as a soul in your freedom, entering a domain, and then you are a victim of circumstances. What happens to the other person who's committing all these crimes, who's committing so much harm? Is there no consequence there? So I was highlighting the freedom of the soul to choose, and even to not be bound to karma. Yes, karma exists, but you're not bound to it. It's not the supreme law. It's one of the secondary or even tertiary laws. There's the soul's self's freedom. But what about the consequence to the person who commits that? You can't say that soul has chosen to commit these crimes. And so here's the important thing to keep in mind. If the other person lived in soul's consciousness, they would not behave that way. Obviously, they don't. And when the person bound in very narrow, little perverse tendencies of nature exercises those perverse tendencies, that soul, though it has chosen to incarnate consciously, that soul will suffer. It will suffer the fact that it is trapped in a personality which is so perverse. Now, depending on the soul's aspiration and maturity or grade of development, there are two possibilities. In one case, the soul simply might say, that's an interesting experience to have a personality so perverted. Since I can do nothing to change it, I'm trapped inside it, let me see what happens with it and learn from this side of the experience. Of course, there are consequences. It knows that and it accepts those consequences. Or it may find itself wanting to break free, unable to exercise its freedom because the personality is so rigidly bound, struggling and thereby suffering also. The life I came for, it's gone so far off track, I'm unable to do anything, help me, ask for the divine help. In some cases, the divine help will come when it cannot free the personality by softer, slower means. It might come with a blow that shatters the outer personality. And sometimes that shock is enough to awaken the soul. This is all assuming the soul is in a conscious evolutionary journey. There are beings who are vital beings, incarnated, then they're just fulfilling their purpose to destroy. There are cases where, and we have discussed this in our current affairs in the early part, where I spoke of how there's a lot of Satanism in the higher layers, where these individuals with conscious evolutionary beings have opened to the satanic influences to a point of semi-partial possession. The possession is now so strong that that thing has taken over. The soul may suffer, suffocate, or even leave in certain cases. And it is now the vital being now embodying, incarnating, and doing all its thing which it wants to do. Are there consequences to the vital being? Yes, perhaps, but anyway, it is of its own grade of consciousness. But in the first few cases where I said the soul is now in the game and is even accepting because it has no other choice, what are the consequences? Yes, there are consequences. The fact that your entire personality was formed in such crude, coarse, ugly perversion. What happens at the time of death is the rigid, coarse human body is removed, but the same grade of consciousness now continues, amplified, because now not so much dulled by the physical body, amplified 100 or 1,000-fold. You're living in that same consciousness of ugly, crude, coarse passions, desires, impulses, which were you're driving. So you tortured other people, you killed them out of hate, out of anger, out of whatever purpose. Now you're full of that with that intensity 1,000 times amplified. What happens then is the grade of consciousness in which you are moves into or lives in the grade equivalent of worlds corresponding to that. Now a world built of hate, crudeness, ugliness, perversion, anger, etc. is literally a world of hell. And you effectively find yourself in the hells of the lower vital worlds, because that's the grade of consciousness you're living in. You suffer the consequences of being in those hells, because everything that you have projected out from yourself is now part of your reality and is coming into you, projected upon you even, by beings which belong to those worlds. That you took pleasure in tormenting somebody was a character of those beings. Now you, vulnerable to them, they take pleasure in tormenting you. Now it's not as if you're being punished. It's not like God says, oh, you did harm, now I'm going to give it back to you. No, it's just consequence of the grade you're living in. And those beings will torment you like crazy. For how long? Well, in the subtle worlds, the sense of time being different, you could experience the torment for years, for centuries, even for millennia. Quite different from physical earth time. Or it could be in terms of centuries of earth time. Irrespective, the point is you would have that intense suffering. As intense was your grade of consciousness and your binding in that ugly hatred and perversion. By the time it, so to say, unwinds and frees itself, you would be undergoing this. Until at some point perhaps it's sufficiently loosened up that something deeper from inside says, but what about those higher things which I had forgotten about? And the consciousness turns up and or is pulled up. Or there's an intervention of a grace from above, a beam of light or a higher being consciousness comes and draws you out. But if you're so bound, even if that light comes, you will feel it as painful. What is that light? It's hurtful and you withdraw from it. You fear it. So even it cannot help you. So you want to see consequences? Yes, consequences are terrible. And for those who commit those terrible crimes, they have to face terrible consequences because of the grade of consciousness they live in. Of course, it can happen. There's a swift intervention. They're pulled out quickly. If there is a grace, that can happen. So I think I wanted to complete the discussion on Pratik's question by this complementing side, which I had not touched upon last time. That yes, there are real consequences to what we do. But primarily it is about the state of consciousness and what you live in and by. What forms in terms of quality your vital body, your mental body, your subtle body generally. And it is in those and by those and with those and in their corresponding grade of worlds that you live when you exit the physical body. And that's why the idea of transition across worlds. Now all of this Sri Aurobindo actually describes and explains in this chapter 22 of the Life Divine. It's very compact, very condensed, and I was avoiding to read the entire chapter, but based on these questions, at some point I think we will go and read from all that. Let's continue with the next question.
From Revati, we have a first question. In Tempest, Mark's latest book, while talking about his future incarnation in the 23rd century, he says alongside other capacities, quoting, I can remember my future on Earth in another biological body, yours, mine, because you and I are the same person. What does the last sentence mean, sir? It seems to reveal something very deep.
Yes. It's an amazing part of the book which I would highly recommend for those who have not seen it to please do take a look. His second book in English, now translated, Tempest. He speaks of past incarnations, and then there's this very challenging for some people concept. He speaks about his future incarnation, which is to happen in about 200 years, as if it's already there, and he's remembering it. And then he speaks of how he's putting influences from his personality now to help shape and form that. And there are elements of it which are precise in detail. Of course, there are things which are not yet formed, but elements which are precisely formed, which he says, this will not change. This is how it is, because it's already formed. So for many of us, the idea that a future which is already present, which is already formed, is something difficult to conceive. So how does one really understand this? And then I'll come to the question itself. The mother also speaks of this. She uses this phrase, memory of the future. It's as if one knows and feels as if something has already happened in the past. That's the nature of memory, except that it's in the future. It's already happened. Interesting. So the idea we have to recognize is, yes, there is an unfolding in time. It's not as if the future is already in place, entirely at least. But there are trends and tendencies, often in this context, chosen by the soul as a consequence of forms it has already set for itself in the current incarnation sequence, which might have been decided and formed a few centuries ago. A lot depends on the soul's maturity, but from the self's point of view at least, certain directions of incarnation are set, and your current incarnation is a part of that direction, which already therefore can anticipate further stages, directions and forms which, freely chosen by the self, are already there formed. They have not yet actualized in the unfolding of time, but they are already existing at a subtler grade as a formed potential, as a real existing thing now. When Sri Aurobindo teaches us how to conceive of the Brahman, there are several aspects. For those of you who are interested, take a look at his description of this in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad. One of the things which you have to include, he says, in the concept of Brahman is all that happened in the past, present and future. But very important, he says, all that happened in the past and tried to happen or could have happened but did not. All of that is already included in Brahman. Then he says, all that is happening at the present tried to happen but could not, could have happened but even did not try to happen. All of these possibilities of the present are also included in the Brahman. And then when you look at the future, all that is the compulsion of current, let's say, trends, circumstances, all that is likely to happen, all that is trying to happen but might not, all that is not even trying to happen but could have happened, all those possibilities simultaneously. And the Brahman includes all this. So what happens is, in the divine consciousness, the sense of past, present and future is so different as you go up, approaching timelessness or the sense of eternity. And these are two different experiences but connected. As you approach that, you have the sense, oh, past, present and even the future, it's there simultaneously at once. And yet the future has not happened in the flow of time, and it's not yet fixed. There are trends which are fixed. And being able to distinguish, Sri Aurobindo says, to distinguish between what is trying to happen versus what is likely to happen versus what will happen, that distinction is very fine, very subtle, requires a deeper perception of the intuition or the psychic discrimination. Then only you can distinguish. Otherwise, people who see things or experience, they can experience one of the possibilities of future and come back with a full experience or conviction that this is going to happen, and it doesn't. How did that? Or something modified from it happens. So you say, oh, maybe the future was likely to happen, then it changed. Maybe not. You can see the actual reality is something much more complex. Everything that could have happened can be experienced. And within that, things which are trying to happen are more firm. Out of that which will actually happen, where literally the self's choice is made and therefore it's already done, but not yet in the time sequence, but done in the future. So it is in this direction that you get a sense of what he means, or why such an experience can happen, that you remember your future. And he describes in the book, he's driving along a particular place in France, which is called the Valley of Remembrance. Suddenly there he experiences his future person flying above in an anti-gravity craft 200 years from now, and that's where he makes the link. So in the book, it's as if he says, I'm speaking to that person 200 years from now, who is me. Describes what it's like, what his parents, what his temperament, etc. are. And he says, if you have all these things, where is me incarnated then? And so I'm now talking to myself, he says. My future on earth in another body, yours, because your body, but mine, because you and I are the same person. And so this is a very interesting experience. As an experience, it is something so amazing. You're here in the present, you're here in the future, and it's you in the future, and you are having this connection, communication, or continuation of identity. It's fascinating as an experience, and quite rare from what I have seen, at least in this kind of literature. And Mark describes this with great detail. It's one of those very special things he has shared in the book. So Revati says it seems to reveal something very deep, and I hope I have given you a glimpse of what that deep thing is. You can go to her next question.
The second question, he also says, if I understood it right, that his former wife, Ocean, chose to acquire the personality that she exhibits in her present lifetime, qualities that we would associate with falsehood and anti-truth. While incarnating, one would choose to experience a life of anti-truth or anti-divine. With such qualities, won't a person risk getting controlled by lower vital beings, demons, and also risk the use of drugs and other substances that are harmful for growth?
Yes, absolutely. And in this case, that was the case. So Mark speaks of, in this book, of meeting the person with whom he had several lives shared across quite a long period of time. And in this particular incarnation, when he meets her and then they got married, so there were things which were, even she remembered things of their past life together, but she was not interested. Her personality was totally different. And it's a good example of how lower vital being, parasite in Mark's vocabulary, demon, had attached itself to her, and the struggle he had to free himself from that whole thing. And it's for him, it's a study. How far can this go? How does this work? He is fascinated by that whole thing also, even though he suffered and he was a victim of that whole thing. So he gives another example where somebody else came in his life who was parasited, and he went out of his way to investigate that. He mentioned to me, it was just last year, he mentioned that he was going out on this exploration to figure out, because he wanted to see firsthand, close up, how the whole thing, mechanism works. So being temperamentally a warrior in this incarnation, that's his drive. But coming to the description itself and the experience, yes, if a soul chose to experience something which involved such a risk, it can happen. It can happen because in the prior incarnation than this one, this lady, who he refers to as Ocean, had already made a pact, which was not a soul's choice. It had already made a pact with that being, and then that hook stuck into this life. Now, in that case, you will not say the soul chose it. The soul was as if in the surface personality now trapped in this entanglement, not being able to free itself sufficiently, then says, okay, let's see how far this goes. What's the learning experience here? So this is something which is again difficult to understand if you don't recognize the mechanics of what the transfer across life takes place. So that's still our theme. How can we carry memory? We have not yet come to the heart of our theme. All this is still related things. We're moving around the overall topic, but keep in mind that it will help us to understand that theme more completely. So let's say in this life, somebody out of sense of ambition engages with a lower vital being. Now the processes are pretty simple. It happened with somebody in the ashram, without naming. He did something which required going to a site where people are buried or cremation ground, where often these low vital beings come to feed on things. Going into that space, he had to do a certain ritual to invoke some being and then make a pact that the being would give it a certain power in return, and this man would do whatever it was. He did it actually. The details are not important. Then mother saw it immediately. When mother met him, first thing she asked, how long has it been with you? She saw the being. As it turned out, he then, driven by the ambition which he had, for which he made the pact. But now what happens, the being's ambition now starts joining with yours, and more a possession begins. Now the being is driving him. He is not realizing it. It's using his ambition as a hook. So the man says, it's my ambition. Now it's getting so much more powerful, so much more large. His vital is being amplified. But whose vital is it? The being's energy filling him. So at some point he wants to go further on, and mother tells him one condition: you will never speak about Sri Aurobindo and the mother's teaching. Something to that effect, she says, and it's recorded in the agenda. He agrees, he goes, becomes very famous, etc., etc. But that perversion now is creeping into him more and more. The more he indulges, he's getting the satisfaction of what he wanted as an ambition. The more he indulges, the more that thing joins and fills him and amplifies it further. At some point, the two literally merge into each other. At what point does that happen? So Mark refers to this also in his book Tempest. He gives the example of a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Sogyal Rinpoche in France, who had gone into extreme perversions, including sexual abuse and other things with young children in his Tibetan Buddhist community in the south of France. At what point that thing has seized him so much that the person is now practically replaced by him. Mark gives that example because he met that man, saw him firsthand, saw what was the thing, the degree of that possession. The point though, it could have started innocently, not because of soul's choice. But once that hook has been made and the integration is made, now when the person is wanting to reincarnate, and to the extent that body is still kept or a part of that body is still retained, the hook remains. That being doesn't want to let go. In the new incarnation, as the soul wants to incarnate, that part of the vital and the being's attachment to it also tends to carry over. How do you free yourself from it? A lot depends on the being. It could be a low-grade being, maybe nothing stays. But a more powerful, more organized being would latch on and then not let go. And then to what extent is because the vital is not fully dissolved, that personality element continuing, and the soul now at that point, at the level of the psychic being, is helpless, unable to free itself. At the level of the self, there is the freedom. It can assert a freedom and say, no, enough, knock it out. But considering the self's perspective as being very different, and across time, across space, is very different perspective, the self retains its equality and says, okay, let's see. The psychic being at that point is struggling perhaps. Still it might say, all right, interesting, let's see how this works. Now, very difficult for us to understand on the surface, but still, it allows this experience, maybe even suffers as a consequence of it. But once started, these things tend to latch on, tend not to leave. It is one of the reasons why in the spiritual life we are told, Do not play with this. Do not make those pacts. Your only communication, your only uh, deep connection is with the divine consciousness, nothing else. Do not mix with this. So I hope I have satisfied Revati's question. Why would one choose? Sometimes it may not be a choice, but having got stuck in one life, it carries over into the next, and at that point, you may choose to see where it goes, and deal with it, or maybe build across a couple of lives the capacity to overthrow and overcome and free yourself, or not. We don't know. So the choice was there in the second case. In the first case, no, it was just the personality got misled perhaps and got into a hook. Or the ambitious drive of the surface personality, the soul may say, and while it's being attached to this power from the being, interesting, let's see where it goes. But it may not have chosen actively always to say, oh, I'm going to get into this. But potentially, since everything is possible, the soul might also say, well, if that happens, let's see also where that goes. Yes, there are dangers and severe dangers. And all of these things you see, even the use of drugs and other substances, which come with it because they're associated with tendencies of the temperament of those beings. You can go to the next question.
From Trinetra, I remember once you mentioned you have a friend who consciously incarnated presently as an Italian man who has a very strong body. What was his method of incarnating consciously?
Okay. I'm not sure. I don't remember Italian man. It's very likely the person I was referring was Mark O'Byrne, Frenchman. Very likely. Because he's one of the cases where I know, a couple of others, but he's one of the most dramatic, where there was a conscious incarnation choosing the parents for a particular grade of the subtle physical body and its strong force, strength, vitality of that grade. And when I asked him about this, he confirmed that it was actually one of the most important part of the choice of those parents. What the rest which came was often even problematic, but well, that's how it works. So, what was the method of choosing incarnating consciously? So this you will find described in great detail in the book Tempest. And see, one of the special features of Mark's memory of past lives. We have many people doing memories from hypnosis or from whatever spontaneous recall. They're all interesting. Some of them might be outright fantasies. Bulk of what comes under hypnosis might be outright fantasies. But some of it might be partially true. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. But in the few cases that we know where there was really reliable recall going across lives, there are very few cases where the recall includes the transition between lives in great detail. So I know only of two cases, Mark O'Byrne being the most detailed, and the second one, which is less detailed in the in-between passage, is Dina Merriam. In her books, she speaks of that passage across lives and the few recollections that she has retained of that, which is also very interesting. And I've seen when the memories came, sometimes I was there, we were in some conference, and then she said, this memory just came. And then she's struggling to find words, and she doesn't know, does it make sense? And of course, because of a certain background which I had, I would say, yes, of course, this is what I had known, or this is what has been said by the mother or Sri Aurobindo. She said, interesting. But the thing itself, when the memory came, was you have struggled to find words. So I've seen that in her case, but with Mark, is far more detailed. It's not as if he recalls all the transitions between lives. But in the last few at least, he has this very clear recall, and he describes in the book in great detail from the immediate past life where there was this abandoned child who died prematurely. Then the passage of transition across being bound in this, what we would call a kind of a vital hell, but of its own creation, of this sense of abandonment that it chooses now to not have anything to do with the world and lives in that until it is drawn out. I mentioned this a couple of sessions ago. Then it's drawn out, and then it recovers its full freedom, it explores, waits, prepares for the next incarnation, and then when it chooses that, how it prepares to engage. So in that, he describes the connection even with the child as a fetus in the womb, staying in the fetus, being thrown out when the mother was in distress and coming back, until the final call when the child is about to be born. At that point, he's outside the body and he has his friends, what he calls his family, and suddenly he feels this tug of the silver cord. The child is being born. He's now going to get into fully slammed into the physical body, and he tells his friends who are there in the subtle body, he says, "Okay, I'll be back shortly," and gets pulled and slams into the physical body. So the whole description is quite remarkable, very detailed, very accurate, reliable, which is the reason why I'm giving to it so much importance. But there you see how the choice is made. In the case of a person who's sufficiently developed and organized to be able to be conscious and make a conscious choice of this kind while retaining even the memory. So already that shows a very high grade of development and integration of the soul's evolution as well as the mental vital bodies. Now this is the critical part for the recall of continuity of lives. And we are going to study this in detail in this particular chapter of the Life Divine. Otherwise, if that part is, a lot of it has been shed, you might not have recall of past life, at least not on that level and not in that detail. But since it's a formed, individualized, developed individuality with the person chooses now because he's conscious and able to choose. In a large number of cases, the psychic being is not sufficiently individualized, evolved, or mature. And it's almost as if half asleep. In its current grade of evolution, it, from its state like a child, yearns for, this direction, this growth, this capacity, this experience. And then there are beings who belong to this domain of the psychic worlds, who as if take and help the child make the link to a particular space or to a particular womb where the fetus is in formation, or while a child is being born, the link to be made, etc. And help it to incarnate in something which would align with its current need and aspiration and requirement. So in more cases than not, at least for our earth with the current evolution of humanity, this is more often the case, that we are helped. The soul itself holds a general sense of purpose, direction, intention. The rest is then carried, helped by these beings to help you to incarnate. But otherwise, method-wise, it's just that you're conscious, this is what you want, and the soul consciousness is one-pointed. And what you've chosen becomes now the reality, and there are circumstances you feel, you wait. In the consciousness, in the collective consciousness and the resonance, you feel, yes, now it's forming. The kind of circumstances I need are forming. And when it forms, you say, yes, this is it, and align and join with it. That's how it feels from that level. How much it is in terms of human time, it could be a few weeks, years, even a couple of centuries, doesn't matter. It all depends on how important, urgent that particular soul's need is. It may say, okay, I want to incarnate urgent enough, I want to be in this space for this particular thing, and in the terms of opportunity, I'm willing to compromise. But this space is what I want. So you've prioritized a certain intention, and where it aligns, you feel drawn, attracted like a magnetic field that pulls you, draws you, and you connect, join with it, and that's how you link with that place, that circumstance, etc. So yes, I think that gives you an idea. It's not a method, it's the normal way the soul relates to the world and the way it incarnates. You can go to the next question.
Another question related from Suraj. When I think of incarnation, I think in related to incarnation on Earth. And then when we have covered the topic on extraterrestrials and different life forms, so we can incarnate in extraterrestrial.
So the moment we think of incarnation, when we think of incarnation, automatically we're thinking of Earth, because from childhood we have never thought of life elsewhere, because we have been taught, education has told us there is no other life, there are no other planets, we are all alone, we happened by chance, and all that nonsense. It's not true. If we had been taught from childhood, every star you see, that is a sun, has planets, or every star that you see, which is actually the point, which is a galaxy, has a trillion suns, each of which has a dozen planets, each of which may have life of some kind. If you've been told this, you would have thought, incarnate, where? That would be a normal thinking. It's just the programming of our education. Nevertheless, yes, it's true, in principle you can incarnate anywhere. In principle. But remember, the soul has chosen freely, and its choice is not a whim. Hey, let's do this now, next time, let me see, I'll decide later. That's not how the soul consciousness works. It lives in a consciousness of eternity, at least at the level of the self. It lives in a consciousness of eternity. So what it chooses is as if aligned to eternity. This bridge of time and eternity is one of those things which, if you try to feel as I'm describing, you'll get a sense of what it feels like. So when you choose, your choice itself exists in eternity, and so as if resonates and extends, aligns with, is in tune with eternity. So even though there's a sense of choice of a particular direction, it has as if a projection or extension into eternity. It's free. It's always free. Nevertheless, there is a direction already set in freedom. So very often what happens for those of us who are more naturally born on our Mother Earth, that direction set means literally for the next 10,000 years or more, million years, your primary line of evolution is going to be on this Earth's incarnations. You could, in principle, having come to a certain level of maturity, say, all right, this time I'm going to actually try an incarnation in a totally different planet to have that kind of experience to enrich myself for what might be useful for here. But again, it's not a fanciful whim. It is totally free. But it will come from a certain necessity that says, oh, for this particular work, I'm missing this need which I can't find in this earth experience which I might get there. And so the alignment. So in most cases, we would say a soul has an affinity with a particular planet. At least for our Earth, that's the case. Having evolved beyond a certain point, while you may still have an affinity, you may choose to go and even build new affinities, etc. So in this case, if you see in the book and in the program we had, Mark speaks of three. His original evolutionary line, which was on a particular sun, and then a special incarnation he took which was of another species, and then coming to this earth there were 37,000 years ago. But there was an affinity from the first to this one, which he shared in the conference that we had. The point though is, it's not too much. You don't like hop around on a whim, hey, next time let me go to that galaxy or that star system. There's already a line set by the very first choices made of a general sense of purpose and direction. Now remember, everything is possible. That's one of the problems with such discussion. So it could be that a soul sets a direction that says, I want to experience the fullness of the most extreme kinds of life forms that I could experience across the most extreme kinds of galaxies, in principle. And then it would have already set in that very impulse a certain pattern of growth which would span multiple kinds, and such a person would be very different. But that's not the case. That's very rare, at least for most of us on Earth. We have as if chosen this, and so there's a deep affinity and relationship even with this sense of Mother Earth and so on. So yes, we can in principle incarnate in extraterrestrial bodies, but this is the case right now. There's a certain process and line of development here specific to our Earth. And the mother speaks of the importance of what is being done on Earth, which is almost like a special experiment in the whole universe of the individualized psychic being. We go to the next.
From Emilien, we will take his first question. Last time you had spoken of certain traditions that would give us access to either rewards or punishments, depending on our past life. But what can we think about the Egyptian tradition and the weighing of the soul? Does it go in the same direction as these other traditions, or can we see it in a different way?
Okay. So when he says last time, it was our first session. And so the question has been pending a couple of weeks already. Our first session on this topic. Today being the fourth session on this topic. So the Egyptian tradition, you have some of the paintings which show images of the soul being weighed. And I think it's Anubis as the deity which is sitting in judgment or watching this, or something in that direction. Uh, you have a similar idea in India in certain traditions and lineages. I believe you will find some of these also in many shamanic lineages in other parts of the world. So I don't know why this question from Emilian, what is it, why he's asking about Egyptian tradition. The sense I have is the question is coming because is it of that grade? I'm going to respond to that in two ways. First, many of us have a fantasy of the Egyptians being very advanced and that their civilization was so great, so advanced, so whatever. Maybe technologically advanced, does not mean much by itself. Look at human brutes today. With extreme technological advances, the consciousness which rules those technologies or uses them is so crude as to be inferior to animals. So in itself, that's never a measure. Second, regarding Egyptian traditions, we actually know very little. And what little we know is largely drawn from these images and interpreted by whatever we would understand from those images. Third, Egypt itself, as in India, as everywhere else on earth, went through a phase where it was in the prior golden age in what might be called a higher position in its development spiritually, and then went through a degradation and a fall. Because the civilization was more primarily occult, contrasting that with India where it was more primarily spiritual. You see, everywhere you'll find a little bit of the spiritual and occult, but what was the dominant theme? In Egypt, it was more prominently occult. In Atlantis, it was more dominantly occult and technological, not primarily spiritual, and so it even got destroyed. The same happened with Egypt. Because being primarily occult, the tendency is always to degrade. The moment you go into occultism, the point is powers, using of powers, and the more you start using for purpose of fulfilling your drives, desires and needs, etc., it becomes like a battle almost. You tend to fall in the gradation of powers accessed for the most immediate, short-term or powerful physical result. So the entire civilization tends to collapse. We see this again in the tendencies of the Indian Tantra. In its origin, the Tantra turned to the Divine Mother as Shakti, and then exploring the powers and aspects of Shakti in all the finer powers, and then the ability to exercise those powers and even wield powers, master those, being one of the objectives in the Tantra. In the later degradation which takes place in large parts of India, the engagement with powers becomes the one-pointed focus of Tantra. So it's no more a spiritual Tantra in those places, and there's just low-grade occultism. So if you tell somebody, oh, a Tantric, the idea is somebody who has powers, who can access beings or who can do things and get material results with his procedures of rituals. That's how it is in the popular understanding today in India. But in reality, there's a very large part, as for example Sri Vidya, where the whole orientation is spiritual, but by ritualistic external means. But it's still spiritual, and there's none of this degradation in object. Nevertheless, even in those lineages, there will be certain exercise of powers. And for the common man, you will value the person because he exercised the power. You'll value him more than someone who did not exercise the power and had actually a higher spiritual realization. Oh, you know, this man, he read my mind, he predicted something, he intervened and cured X, he transmuted metal into gold, whatever it is. The exercise of the power suddenly makes him, oh, he's more great than that man who did not do any of these things. Or maybe he did, but less. And that's just our human interpretation coming from outside, from a lower grade, not understanding. But the decline was inevitable with the decline of the 4 stages of the cycle. So what has happened in Egypt is also this. There was, let's say, at a certain core, maybe a few who held the spiritual to some degree. In the ashram, there was one disciple. He was German, originally German, and the name Sri Aurobindo, or the mother, gave to him was Medhananda. He was an exceptional being. He had an affinity with the Egyptian tradition. he seemed almost like someone who was a pharaoh reincarnated, and he had that majesty also, and kingly, and he was an exceptional being among the human beings of even of today. We had around Sri Aurobindo, many exceptional people came of a very high order from the history of human development, and he was one of those. But for a long time, being of something of that came through in his writings. He got very interested in the Egyptian symbolism, linked it to the Vedic symbolism, actually seemed to say that they followed literally the Vedic symbolism but with some kind of reduction. And I believe there's a truth to that. Practically everywhere you go on earth, you'll find the worship of the sun, and that's straight from the Vedic tradition. But it's not as if, you see the sun, so you start worshipping the sun, isn't it? It comes from a deeper perception and insight in which you see what is behind or beyond. And that's what was the case with the Veda. But because there was a period where across the world, the basic Vedic vision, experience, perception of reality was saturated in the last, what we would call golden age, Satya Yuga. And so the decline from there is what you see in what remains today in all these traditions. So many symbols are similar, but they've lost completely their original spiritual sense. And we see this in Egypt. So at a certain stage, the sun god, and I've spoken of the symbolism of the hand of the sun being like a ray of intuition, and the priest receiving, or the king receiving the ankh, the symbol of life from that, etc. So these are very clearly spiritual symbols. The king himself as if embodied something of a high spiritual presence, evolution. And there was this huge difference between these elites and the common masses, which is why they did not interbreed. That interbreeding was considered a sin, because what would be a product would have something of the powers which came with their higher, let's say, competence, but with a tendency which was more animal, closer to the human. And so they could get angry, they could misuse the power, etc. This is one of the ideas you'll find across traditions which are old enough, that they have an elite and then they have the common people, and they don't mix. The same idea remains today in a kind of a royalty everywhere. The royal will not marry a commoner. But practically today there's no difference. But in those days the difference was actually substantial. So they maintained this. Gradually there has been a blending, etc. I'm giving you this background so you understand what the whole Egyptian issue is about. In the declining phase, there was a lot of occultism. Everywhere where you see those crocodiles and those mummifications of cats and other beings, it's all low-grade occultism. And it's a long period of time. In that incarnation where the mother was Queen T, or where the mother had incarnated as Hatshepsut, there were attempts to as if redirect and lift the whole civilization once again to a higher spiritual possibility. And as you can see, it held for a while and then again broke and fell. But these are the attempts which actually lift the common grade. And then the fall, and then a gift, and a fall. What has happened across is, as everywhere else where there was a low-grade occultism, all these images come. Where the soul being weighed is typically belonging to some of the lower vital domains. And these are ideas which belong to worlds of those kinds, and where you have reward, punishment, etc. And you have worlds actually where you can experience these types of things. You have the idea that you're going to be judged by some kind of judges who are going to condemn you. You leave your body, you enter a world where that's the reality that you experience, except it's a creation of your mind. But because that's what you're aligned to, there are gradations of vital worlds which align to that grade of consciousness, and you will be in that realm where you will be projecting or creating the scenarios that you want to or you believe in, and literally go through those experiences until at some point you will wake up enough that you'll say, hey, something is wrong. Everything I expect to see, I'm seeing. Let me try. And you will something and you see that happen. And you say, then I'm creating my reality. What's the real thing? And you start looking for something beyond, and that's when you are open to move on to the next level, and you free yourself from this illusory passage. In the Christian tradition, in the Catholic Church, they call this the purgatory. But what they understand by that term today is still very shallow, but this is the reality of this. So you kind of purge, that's why purgatory. You purge all the things which cling to you, And as you purge them, you're free to move on to higher levels, and then until you come to your actual state of evolution as in the central part of you and in the degree of freedom. So all this I have given as a backdrop to symbols, images which you might see on those on the Egyptian pictures, weighing of the soul. Now you could see this purely in terms of a low grade belief system, or if you want, you can read into it a symbol of something of a higher truth, but now reduced to an accessible level of humanity, but in the process losing the primary truth of it. Now, I give this example I've said before. In India, for example, we hear sometimes these stories told to children. Oh, there's that fellow, he's the writer, Chitragupta, who notes down everything you're doing, and you're going to be judged later. Watch out, you tell that to children. Not very nice thing to do, but it serves a purpose. The idea, though, is it's a reduced symbolism accessible to a child's mind of a deeper truth that, well, there is an imprint in the Akashic records, and even that is a conscious imprint, or there's a conscious being presiding over it. That's the truth of it. But when spoken in such terms, you're almost humanizing it. There's a guy with a desk and a pen and he's writing. When you come after death, he'll say, let me look at your records and now I'm going to judge you. You see how it reduces because of the way the image was put. So the same thing you could say, weighing of the soul. The idea would be here simply that what is the sense of growth that you have? What's the value of your evolution? And that's being as if weighed or assessed. Maybe it could be a high spiritual concept reduced in a form which seems now somewhat simplistic. Or it could be, hey, now you're going to be judged and sent to heaven or hell. If you were a Christian looking at this image, you'd say, this is what's happening. If you were somebody with a deeper, clearer, freer spiritual background, you'd say, maybe they're taking the value of the soul's current evolution, or how much it has grown in this lifetime. But there's not going to be a judgment. There's not going to be hell or heaven. You see, so what do you interpret from that image? I don't know. I don't know what was actually there. I'm just showing you that one could interpret on many levels. And it could still belong to a lower grade of the descending curve of the Egyptian tradition, which had already got lost into low grade occultism. You find in Carlos Castaneda, which is very shamanic, low grade Central American occultism of a very low kind, opening to lower vital worlds and beings of lower vital worlds. And there even the idea exists that when you leave your body, there is this eagle-like being which is going to eat your soul, and if you want to survive, you need to escape that. And so all your training and preparation is to form a kind of a vehicle to be able to move out before you get eaten by this very crude, coarse beliefs, and largely bound in this low-grade occultism. And so I don't know which one it is for Egypt, but I'm showing you a big picture so you might understand what might be possibilities. Let's go to the next.
A second question from Emilienne. Marco Burns shares an experience of a life he would have in parallel to the one he currently has. Other authors also share this kind of experience, such as Canon Dolores, Gita Malez, talking with angels. It's reminiscent of the mother's words in the agenda when she says she had 4 emanations at the same time. Can you shed some light on this?
It's interesting. There are people who have spoken of this also. So Mark recalls in his first book, he speaks of how at some point it's as if he switched places with somebody else who was yet himself. And it was a disorienting experience, but it might have been that other person was sharing his body while he was sharing that one's body, yet it was himself. So it was one of those experiences where he came back with a very confused idea, or a much more enlarged idea of what does it mean to be an incarnation. It's as if I have several incarnations at the same time. So yes, this thing is something Sri Aurobindo has referred to also, of how there is a presiding consciousness which could put out multiple emanations. Not all of these would be distinct in their psychic being. So there's a complexity around that. Our earth, though, being primarily a space where, like I use that phrase, individualized psychic being, generally it happens that a person has one incarnation with one individualized psychic being. generally. It could still be that there are two. And there are a few very rare cases that one knows of where, for example, twins who were genetically identical at birth were separated. They never knew there was somebody else who was their genetic identical. Much later in life they meet, and it turns out they both have the same names. They have married women with the same names. They have dogs to which they have given the same names. They have the same favorite colors. Literally, one has the impression as if their lives mirrored each other almost at the same time together. How do you explain that? And perhaps one explanation would be that at that point the soul actually was inhabiting both bodies. And so whatever it was doing was mirroring in the other, or it was simultaneously living in both, and so they ended up doing pretty much the same thing. There are rare cases. More often than not, at least for this planet, our Earth, it is an individualized incarnation. And one could always have that exception nevertheless. So the mother speaks of, and I'm impressed by all the variety of kinds of literature that Emilian has read and recalls from. But yes, mother speaks of having 4 emanations at the same time. She speaks of beings who had multiple emanations. If you recall, even when she speaks of that, one of the great asuras, that he had actually 1,000,000 emanations on earth. And so when she would meet those emanations, she would recognize, oh, it's this one particular asura, and then engage with the asura through the emanation. So there were many people in the ashram who were actually emanations of specific asuras. This is one of those stories which I think it is too early to tell. Some of the names are very well-known, popular, respected figures. And if you suddenly say, hey, mother actually said that one was an asura of that particular one, it'll hurt a lot of people. So it's one of those stories which might be told later. We'll see. But in those cases, through that person, the mother was accessing the main asuric being behind, and in converting through this person, her effort was to convert the allegiance of that. As a result, as a consequence, because such a person came close to the mother physically, the extent of the incarnation also amplified enormously. She tugged upon the being behind, you see. So it's one of those things which is difficult for us to fully understand unless one actually sees the experience behind. But it's rare, it's not very common, but it does happen. And that's the reason why there is not too much in the literature of this kind. So Mark's case is exceptional also. It's not very common, like I said. You can go to the third question.
There's something else I'm curious about. What other soul in the body several years after birth?
Okay. What is it? I think we lost your words a few briefly. The question was, there's something else I'm curious about. What can you tell us about walk-in? Incarnation of another soul in the body several years after birth. So a walk-in is a term which comes from a large part of mostly American literature. And at some point they were promoting that as you should become a walk-in, meaning you have to allow other souls to incarnate through you and act through you, effectively become a medium or allow them to possess you and things like that. Never, never, ever allow such a thing. Not even the idea of it. As far as you are concerned. You may see others, that's a different story. Never allow that. Because always anything which would want to come in this way is of a lower grade. Vital beings which need to engage, which want to use you, which want to harm you, which want to mess with your life, mess with earth life, mess with humanity, delay, divert, confuse current evolution, etc. Or just have power and control human beings, feed on them, have fun, whatever form. So never allow, even an idea, for any kind of mediumship, possession, walk-in, etc. This is, having said this, what does it mean? What happens? Well, it's just a variation on mediumship, but the walk-in is supposed to be something more dramatic, where literally from one day to the next, a being comes in, takes over, and you are thrown out or pushed behind, and some other personality takes over. So I remember reading long ago, Madame Blavatsky had this experience that She fell, she had an accident, she emerged from that, and it was a different person. And I think it was known or it was spoken of. Unfortunately, these are things of nearly 30, 40 years ago that I had read. Uh, and I might be confusing a few elements, but the idea was that someone else had taken her body and had now, from that point, her real work started. It was supposed to be a being of wisdom who was then manifesting a lot of knowledge and so on. So that can happen, very, very rare. In such cases, it is actually a soul engagement, a soul connection, a soul agreement. It could have happened before incarnation, that the agreement was made, that at a certain stage I will allow for this other being to fill in or participate or share in my experience and learn from it. In which case you might have something which is like a walk-in type, but that would be purely from the soul's choice. And the beings in such cases would, one would assume, be of a certain higher grade and not of the lower grades. But again, that is very rare. And they come for a specific purpose, partly. In some cases, they are there for a while and then they withdraw once that work is done. There's one case which I know, and I had been to a community. I met the person. He was the person I've referred to before who had this free energy machine. Where I understood, I didn't know this earlier, that the person who built that machine was one such. So this person was very highly developed, but he had a certain ability and an affinity to open to higher beings who would as if plug into him, work through him, do their work and then withdraw. And of course during that period it would be a completely different personality and sometimes quite extraordinary things. The difference though in his case was, it demanded a huge preparation of purity for a being of that grade to be able to incarnate. It was difficult, it's not easy, and it's not what would happen to a normal human being. You needed a high spiritual development where you could align to something of a certain grade that you had already been able to access, and then that being would partially as if send out a projection and through you do a certain work and withdraw when the work is done. Very rare, very demanding spiritually. But one who has the skill, one who has the capacity and developed consciousness can actually do that once in a while if so needed. Now you'll see in passing, it is more like a form of a fun that Mother speaks of how they shared two angelic beings who were with her always, intended to protect her. And one of them actually wanted to experience draw. He wanted to share something because she could draw very beautifully. She said okay, and she lent her arm to him or lent her hand to him, and he kind of plugged his hand in and tried to draw, and she said it was not very good. Consciously, it's not a possession, it's not a full possession even, it's a kind of handing over a part of your vehicle of the body for a particular purpose. But it shows you that, with a bit of skill one can do such things also. But that's not a very high being either. But what was happening, for example, at a certain stage in the ashram where the mother was creating links between the human beings and the overmental gods, in that period of about 2 years where many interesting experiences took place. It was not a walk-in, but it was a deep alignment where something of that divine consciousness of those deities was as if infusing into the human, filling and working through them. Generally, the higher beings do not incarnate. They will not do a walk-in. They will put out an emanation, a partial emanation, aligning with yours. And in the process, as you grow with their help, they experience a growth from the participation with you. Such is normally the case where such alignments take place. And this is often the case for some of the exceptional beings on earth, the Vibhuti types which I mentioned last time, where because of your deep alignment, some consciousness of the divine, some aspect, some being that represents that aspect aligns with you, helps you, gives you the necessary push, but also through that learns, participates and evolves through you. This is the interesting thing. The reason I paused in between, because I just remembered a couple of things which I had heard from Mark O'Byrne. See, these are the kinds of things which give me so much satisfaction when I hear from Mark O'Byrne independently. He has no idea of what we have heard from the Mother of Sri Aurobindo, and he says things which are so exactly aligning purely from his experience. And then I tell him, oh yeah, by the way, the Mother said it. He says, oh okay, she seems to have said everything. Sri Aurobindo seems to have said everything. So I give this example. Mother mentions those angelic beings, the two angels she had, and she said they had wings. So she asked them, why do you have wings? And they said, because we like them, they look nice. Now, independently, Mark narrated this in his conference this time. Uh, he saw one of these angelic beings with wings. At first he said, this is surely a formation, not a real being. So he tried to erase them. But it turns out there is actually a being. He was shocked that these things actually exist, which we hear in literature. So he asked the same question, why do you have wings? You don't need wings to fly in the subtle body. So the angel counter questioned him, why do you have feet? You don't need feet, right, in the subtle body. So he concluded that they liked it. And then they created a wing for him, just like that, by willing it, because the matter is plastic. So he said, nice, oh, beautiful wings. That's all. But it's the same conclusion. They like it, that's why. It looks nice, that's all. So these are examples of where you see this close affinity and which also confirms things. So there was this another example which came to mind, which he also shared, which regarding this particular matter. Never mind, it'll come back. So an example that the mother had shared about something, and then Mark again gave an example which was exactly the same thing. It'll come back later, doesn't matter. So I'm going to take a pause from this, going back to the earlier question of Emilem with the Egyptian tradition. So in the chat box, Maya has shared some knowledge of the Egyptian tradition. She says, weighing of the heart ceremony was only depicted in much later discovered tombs, not from the Old Kingdom, and was very similar to traditions of judgment in the cruder traditions that you mentioned in the first video. If the soul was heavier or more sinful than the feather of Maat, the goddess of justice, it was devoured by Amut, the devourer. So this is what is at least understood regarding the Egyptian tradition and the Egyptian teachings. But again, my problem with this is there is no existent living being who carries the continuity of the Egyptian lineage of the original tradition and knowledge. All that we have is interpretations of what people have read, understood in the Egyptian tradition from symbols, images, or writings which are often very complex symbolism. But yes, this is an idea which aligns very much with what we find in the later part in that region, and then later in the Christianity, which is heavily influenced by, incidentally, the Egyptian Kabbalah traditions. So if the other thing comes back, we'll go to the next question from Emilian.
When you spoke of past existences remaining in the background of our present existences, it reminds me of certain passages in Mother's agenda when she tells Satprem that she sees him accompanied by one of her former incarnations as a yogi or ascetic. I have a few more questions that I hope it can be included in the current team because they're very important to me. So we'll see if the time remaining for.
No, I don't think we'll have time. So I think with this we will close for today at least. The other questions we may keep for next time. So what he has described is interesting. Sri Aurobindo describes how certain facets of the prior personalities of the soul and the content of that learning is held behind or put forward, or parts of it blended to form the new personality. So he says it reminds him of certain passages in the mother's agenda where she tells Satprem she sees him accompanied by one of her former incarnations. While he was a yogi or an ascetic, one of her former incarnations is with him, and she sees that image. So what is interesting here is the imprint of that alliance, of that her influence on him at that time, that is still vividly present here. And so she sees not only his past, she sees her emanation present in that past. That's quite remarkable, isn't it? many many could develop, let's say, subtle sight, where you see what is in your aura, colors, etc. Sometimes images, symbols, you don't know what it is, you just see it, and maybe you interpret correctly, you interpret wrongly, you just see a symbol, you don't know what it means always. Unless there's some deeper intuition, which then reveals what it might be or what it is, etc. Just this is not enough to be able to see past lives. That comes from a different kind of perception. So then there are, let's say, a few people who can sense what are the elements of past lives, let's say to some extent. But then to see within that details just in your first glimpse, that's already a very highly developed capacity. So I'm putting in context what mother is doing so casually. I'm putting that in context to show you that it's not something very common, that ability to see. If I remember right, my teacher had told me, I don't think I read that portion in the agenda, where when Satprem came first to the mother, she was looking at him continuously for nearly half an hour. Just like that, nothing spoken. In which she saw the entire journey of all his past lives. I think she said that to him at some point. She saw the entire journey of his past lives. But obviously she was also doing something else. Through him, she was also entering in a rapport with the being of which he was an emanation. And so this is one of those very interesting examples where mother was doing things on multiple levels while working with this person, this individual. So maybe this we will have occasion to discuss another time. But just to show you that there is a human journey, there could be behind that some presiding being, supporting, backing, or providing with an emanation. And the mother's skill to see immediately, spontaneously, not only those elements of the human evolutionary journey, her place in it, as well as this thing, and then operating on all these at the same time. Wow. Wow, it is so rare, so exceptional, so wonderful, so extraordinary. And my teacher used to say that there's never been such an incarnation, such an extraordinary expression of the Divine Mother's capacity on earth before. Mother herself spoke of this in different words. She said she had never come with as much power as this time. You see, in prior incarnations or emanations, we will say more accurately, where she came with the divine avatar as the supporting or the expressive power of the Shakti, of course incarnating at that time also in physical form. Among all those, this is the time when the maximum expression of her power has been in place. But you can also see it's not just a power to act and to change circumstances, but also the power of perception even to such an extraordinary degree. It's so amazing. I'll just look at the chat box briefly. Trinetra is asking, who are the four emanations of the mother? Is Madame Thion one of them? No, it's not the case. I don't think she mentioned specific names, but certainly Thion was not. In fact, Monsieur Thion, the Mr. Thion, who was husband of Madame Thion, was an emanation, I believe, of the Lord of Death, if I'm right, one of the Asuras. And so there was this incident when the mother arrives there to stay with them, part of the training that she is accepted to have with them. It seems he looked at her, very dominant, possessing strong, vital personality, and then he says, now you are entirely under my control. Aren't you afraid? Straight away, the Asuric side of him just takes over and dominates, wants to impose fear. And mother's response, no, the divine is within me, I'm not afraid. And that forcefulness and certainty with which she speaks this, she says, he became white with fear. What is this? Who is this? He becomes afraid, interestingly. Jessica comments that South and North American Indian history goes back at least 14,000 years, advanced pyramids in Mexico. There were so many North American natives that ate North American camel into extinction. Okay, I don't know. So yes, it's a fact that most of these pyramids which survive, whether in Egypt or in the Americas, they were all well before the tradition of the people that you know there, Aztecs, Incas, etc., whatever you have, are of a much later and much lower grade technologically, but also in terms of spiritual development. They happen to have the pyramids there present. Who built them, even they do not know. They have no idea what it is. Many of them use those pyramids, especially in the South Americas. There was a lot of this human sacrifice. They use the pyramids and the top of the pyramid as a point of sacrifice. I don't think the original pyramids were built for that purpose, but they were used for that purpose later on. So it's one of those things which it's a very low dark passage in Earth history, what they actually did with those pyramids later on. But who built those? Obviously it belongs to something much, much earlier, belonging to the period which could be called the previous golden age, and which is what I referred to as the time when the Vedic influence was across the world. Madhuri asked an interesting question. I had faced challenges in life. Challenge is a euphemism for crisis. Okay, so I had faced challenges in life, and every time I was trapped in, I was questioning myself that is this my choice? And a strong feeling comes every time that yes, it is my choice. So her question, what lesson can I get from this? So when you ask this, is it my choice? You are making a verbal representation of something you want to know, and you're giving a verbal answer for something. The problem with verbal articulation is that it is always deceptive and a reflection of the truth. So let me state it in other words, and then perhaps it will make more sense. When you say, is it my choice? It's not as if you said, oh, now I want this crisis to come and hit me. But from the soul's perspective at the time of incarnation, either of two things. Either there was a broad sense of purpose, I am going to learn these things and overcome these things and grow through these things. And because that is the primary sense of purpose, inevitably as those things happen, circumstances around you form to assist or express. And with it, depending on what was chosen, certain forms of crisis may or may not come, which would correspond to the fulfillment of that. So in that sense, you chose. But what you chose was this line of development and this growth of consciousness. The crisis was incidental, maybe not necessary, but maybe consequential to this. But still you chose. So it won't be right to say, I chose to have this crisis come and crush me. That's not how it was. You chose this line. Second possibility exists, where actually the soul foresaw and intended, or at the very least foresaw, that if I choose this line, this kind of crisis at some point I will face head on. So for example, if you have chosen to stand for a higher truth in a particular space, let's say you enter politics, you want to act to serve your country and you are going to act with power to make a certain change. The soul will foresee, oh, this will lead to a series of very powerful oppositions. You see, all this happens in an instant in the soul consciousness, because it's not through a mental process. In an instant in your soul consciousness, you're experiencing, here is this warped, distorted space, and I'm going to push through like a clean, bright sword of light, cut through and make this shift. Okay? So in the experience, while this sword of light that you're going to express cuts through, you're going to have these 2 or 3 pressure points of tremendous pain. You sense it, you know it, even before you incarnate. That's how the soul senses, knows. Okay? So when it sees, senses this, it accepts. This is what I want to do, irrespective of that. Now, depending on the nature of that pressure point of pain, fierce opposition, violent crisis, even there may be a point where your survival might be put in danger. You're aware of that even before you incarnate. When, how, who, what, none of the details exist. It's purely consciousness meeting consciousness, and this is certain, inevitable. There's no escaping it because it's on that level, almost essential. Then, while the life unfolds, while the circumstances happen, this person pops up, becomes now the obvious major enemy who starts doing the mischief, etc., etc. But what happens, it may not be this person. If for some reason you eliminate this person, somebody else comes in, replacing to fill the particular role of that energy, which is the opposition energy that you're going to overcome. And the crisis still happens. Specifics may or may not be exactly this way or that. That's not important. Sometimes even that is known, but that's secondary. So again, in that sense, you have chosen. But it's not as if you chose, hey, I'm going to have this crisis, I'm going to get attacked like this, and so it's the consequence of a particular line of experience chosen for a particular line of growth and development, in which you already sense certain possibilities of crisis, opposition, patterns. And then it happens. Or, which is one of the variations in these two, as that happens, you have grown spiritually and you align with a higher help, and although the crisis forms, it is dissolved by higher intervention, things change, the form of the crisis shifts, the crisis is still there, but it leads to consequences which are very different, and so on. Or while doing that, some other soul chooses a line of development which is similar, and you have an affinity of purpose, and so you have a companionship and a protection and mutual aid which comes. All this can happen and would be sensed, seen at that point at the higher stage, when the broad line of purpose of life was conceived, felt, chosen, selected. So I hope this will help you to appreciate what is meant by it was your choice. And the lesson from it you can get is simply to recognize that the crisis is not essential. It is the growth of consciousness, the fulfillment of the purpose that you are incarnating, expressing, growing through, fulfilling. And the rest is you accept as circumstances, and you do the best you can. Ask for help. Always ask for help. This is one of the aspects of the freedom of the soul. Even though you may do things by your choice, you also can ask for help where it is beyond your capacity. Do that always, and especially in moments of crisis. Ask for the help. And as soon as you sense the crisis forming, if you sense that, oh, this is going to be a difficult passage, ask for the help. And sometimes, even though the crisis forms, you are as if carried through in the arms of the Divine Mother. While it's happening, the storm is around you, you barely get any blow from it. You feel nothing of it almost. And that can happen. Or occasionally there can also be an intervention. What could have been a long, protracted process is suddenly compressed, reduced, and the intensity diminished, the time reduced, and you still have the thing, but now so different, so much reduced. But the nature of that crisis was always there. Both of these are possible, but ask for the help, because that is one of the things you have which is also your soul's highest truth. You're not just a soul individual, you're also the divine consciousness of which you are a part, a projection, a child. Trinetra asks, does Deepti publication ship worldwide? Yes, you can. You can get pretty much everywhere. So I think this is the theme we will close on for the moment to concentrate on. Remember, our whole discussion is still looking at the big picture of what can we do, how can we carry over our consciousness from this life to the next consciously, how can we incarnate consciously without losing the sense of purpose, without losing the sense of all that we have developed now. That's the text we took from Sri Aurobindo, of which we started with a few portions which had to do with concept of karma, soul, how it forms the personality, and why the memory has to be held back, etc. There are a few more things in that same chapter where he describes what happens in between, what is the nature of the transition that the soul makes between lives, the sense of the worlds, what determines which world you are in, etc. I'd skipped that largely But I think because of the kinds of questions that we have received so far, it will be worth it to at least go through that passage, even if in summary form. And you'll see how much Sri Aurobindo is able to convey in just a few lines. It's one of the most amazing things. In one sentence, he will describe to you like this, and this is how it is, that's the relation. Boom. You've understood at such a fundamental, core, essential level that 100 questions are answered just like that. So in this chapter, particularly in relation to what happens between lives in the transition, where we have a couple of paragraphs where he discusses this. We will cover that next time. And we have also a couple of questions still pending, but we'll merge them along as we proceed. Let's take a moment to concentrate on this and the theme which around the question which we just dwelt upon, the sense that the soul's choice, whatever may be the circumstance of difficulty as Madhuri has described, that there is the Divine Mother's help. There is a Divine Presence constantly, and it's also the soul's free choice to ask for the help. And the more we are able to shift in grade of consciousness by aligning, unifying with the Divine Consciousness, the more the nature of the crisis itself undergoes a shift. Like I said, the crisis will be there. But your consciousness is so different that it's almost not a crisis to you. It's just choppy waters, you still sail through. You get across, that's about all. That there were choppy waters. So the crisis can be dramatically diminished by that shift. And this is our choice. This is, in fact, I would say, should be our effort, should be our responsibility. So take a moment to concentrate on this. Whatever the circumstances of life, however difficult they may seem to be at any given moment, ask for the help, align to the help, do what you have to do to the best of your capacity, in remembrance, in connection with the Divine Presence, with the Divine Mother in your heart, with the Divine Presence in your heart. Let her fill your mind with light and wisdom. Let her fill your life energies with her strength, force and stability. Let her fill your arms and senses with the skill and precision of perfection that is required. And let her fill your heart and soul with her love. And with that, with her presence in her four aspects, you flow through the challenges and sail through as smoothly as possible. Such should be our effort. Namaste.
Okay, thank you.